Hi everyone! Welcome to the June edition of ngCopenhagen. I'm super happy to have you all here. My name is Sherry List, and I am one of the organizers of ngCopenhagen. I normally organize this meetup with Mosen, Peter, and Alexander, but as most probably you Danes know, tonight is the St. Hans night. So I'm pretty sure that my co-organizers are enjoying the St. Hans night. And thanks for all of you that you are watching us today and decided to join us first and then go to the St. Hans night. So for today, our agenda is pretty simple and awesome at the same time. First, we are going to have Manfred Steyer that going to show us the 5 facts about Microfrontends. I'm personally so interested to watch this presentation and learn from Manfred. And after that, Ashnita Bali is going to show us how to bind to the CSS custom properties in Angular. So as you know, everything is online. So if you have any of your questions, please use the chat functionality and then type there. After each of these presentations, Manfred and Ashnita, each of them, they are going to answer all of your questions. So as usual, if this is the first time that you're listening to us, that we always have this slide that we need you. We need your feedback. We need you to be our next speaker. We need you as a sponsor, volunteer. So please fill out our feedback form. I'm going to post the link to the chat later on as well, because we really want to improve. So we need your opinion. So before we start, I just want to remind you about our code of conduct, which is pretty simple. We want you to, when you actually make a comment, please keep in mind that make sure that we don't write something that is going to affect kind of offend anyone. And if you ever feel uncomfortable, please let me know. We are taking we want to have a very nice and inclusive environment for everyone. So we make sure that everyone feels welcome. So I'm not going to take much of your time. We are going to have our very first speaker, Manfred Steyer. Most of you already know him. To me, he is one of the most knowledgeable speaker that we have in our Angular community. He's a GDE and also MVP. He's based in Graz in Austria, and where they have really awesome pumpkin seed oil. And if you never tried it, I really recommend you, because if you one time that you try, even though that I love olive oil, don't get me wrong, if you add a pumpkin seed oil on your salad, you'll make sure that next time you will kind of crave for it, and you make sure to find it even you don't have it in your country. So with that in mind, so please welcome Manfred Steyer on the stage, and let's get started.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So thanks, Sherry, for having me. And I would say let's get started. Yeah, so the idea was to talk about 5 things you should know about micro frontends, but honestly, I could not decide because there are so many important topics no one speaks about. And so at least I have come up with 6 things and 1 additional thing. So let's have a look at it. And before we talk about micro frontends, I want to start with a picture. Who remembers this woman? Do you remember her? I give you a hint, namely, yeah? Does it ring a bell? It was from Knight Rider, and she was funny. She was the engineer in that team. She was the computer scientist and she was the electrical engineer. And when something was broken, she repaired it. And she really inspired me when I was a child because she did all those great things, even though she was not the star of the show. The star was this other guy from the beach with the red trousers. I don't remember his name, but she really inspired me. And I think because of her, I asked my parents to buy me a computer. I told them, well, it might be beneficial for school. Of course, it was not, perhaps a little bit, but yeah, so I ended up with having a computer and feeding like money. But one thing that is really funny, when thinking back about Bonnie in Knight Rider, we see that she was a one-woman show. And nowadays, we don't have one man or one woman shows anymore because software engineering is a team sport. We need a full team with diverse people with different skills. And most of the times, it's not only a team sport, most of the times, you have to coordinate several teams. So it is a team sport or something like this. And while coordinating one team is difficult enough, you can imagine coordinating a bunch of teams is even more difficult. And so people are wondering what to do to to manage all those complexity, to manage all those teams. And one idea that is quite old is not writing monoliths anymore. A monolith, is this big application capable of everything. It can cook a coffee for you and it can buy you a book. And by the way, it might also book a flight for you. So it can really do everything for you. Don't do this. Instead of this, go with microservices. Write several tiny services like a booking service for booking a flight, a check-in service, a luggage service, or a boarding service. The big advantage of this is you can give each team its own service and they can work independently. They can work on their service without interrupting each other. They can even deploy when they are done. They don't have to sync up with other people. So we have here a lot of services. You could also call them subdomains with domain-driven design, and one team takes care for each and every subdomain. If we take this idea from microservices and put it into the front end, we are ending up with something you might call a micro front end. It is the same idea, but instead of having little services, we have little applications, and each application is managed by a team of its own. So as you see here, the theory is quite easy, but in practice, this brings a lot of questions, and I have discussed those questions really a lot in the last years with my customers, and here I have the top 6 of those questions for you. But before we talk about those questions, let me introduce myself. I am Manfred. I am a trainer and consultant for Angular. Currently, I'm doing a lot of remote workshops and remote consulting. My main product is this Angular workshop for enterprise applications with a lot of advanced topics. And also, as you see here, I'm quite connected to the Angular community. For instance, I'm a trusted collaborator in the Angular team. And when it comes to collaborator, I always like to tell this little story. Perhaps the situation is similar in Copenhagen. We have also the term collaborator in German, and it means exactly the same. The English collaborator and the German collaborator is the same. There is just one difference. In German, collaborating always means teaming up with other people to destroy something. So it has a really bad meaning. And well, in the first time, my collaboration was more of the German sense. and hopefully I've reached the English sense of collaborating with the Angular team meanwhile. Saying this, I'm doing a lot of stuff in the German-speaking area, and sometimes if I promise to behave well, I'm also allowed to enter other countries or to do remote stuff nowadays with other countries. Okay, so much about me. And now I would say let's get started with the questions I brought with me. And the first question is how to implement microfrontends. Because having a lot of tiny applications is easy, but presenting those applications as a common big thing to the user is not easy at all. And when it comes to this question, I have several answers. Let me just check something. Yeah, everything is fine. I have several answers. For instance, we can just do hyperlink integration. This works well for a product suite like Office 365 or the Google Suite. Besides this, we can also load several web components into an index HTML. So if you like web components, if you like the idea of tiny reusable framework agnostic components, go with this. You can even load several separately compiled SPAs into your index HTML. Normally we don't do it, but in this case you will. You have this main bundle from the first SPA, you have that main bundle from the second SPA, and on demand you load it. And then you might have some meta logic, which is switching between those two SPAs, which is doing some kind of meta routing. We can also load separately compiled Angular modules. There are some tricks to do this. And there is a very new feature, and I'm really excited about it because it's a game changer. It's called Webpack 5 Module Federation. The other options works quite well, but for the other options, you have to do a lot of things by hand, like routing between your SPAs. With Module Federation, you get a lot of those features out of the box. And that's why I will focus on Module Federation today. So let's have a look into a demonstration for Module Federation. What we see here is a shell. A shell is just an application which is capable of loading other applications. And this happens when I'm clicking at flights. Another application is loaded into this shell. To prove it, this application can even run in standalone mode, which means it can be developed in isolation, it can be deployed separately, and during runtime, the shell is just fetching the newest version of this micro frontend or a configured version and displaying it here in the working area of our shell. If we look at the network tab, we will see something that's really beautiful. When we look here, we see then when clicking flights, only a tiny bundle is loaded. Let me zoom in here, only a tiny bundle with the nice name 798, what else? And if you look here at this bundle sizes, you see, okay, 90 bytes, yeah, that's because of caching. But if we would not cache, it had about, I would say, 3 bytes. So let me try to clear the cache. Here we go. Yeah, 3 bytes. Here you see it. So that's nothing. And that really proves that with this style of programming, I'm only loading the source code of the application, but not the framework a second time. No one wants to load Angular 5 times because of having 5 micro frontends. And no one wants to load RxJS 20 times because of having 20 micro frontends. What we want to load is just and really just the source code that is needed to display this or that use case. Perhaps you're saying, yeah, Manfred, come on. You are showing us lazy loading. Lazy loading is an old topic. And I'm saying, no, This is not just lazy loading. This goes far beyond lazy loading because we have an application of its own. It runs in standalone mode and we load it on demand. Let me reload everything. If we look here to our bundle one more time, you see localhost 3000. And if we move up here, you see localhost 5000. So it is a completely different origin. And that's not possible without dirty tricks using Webpack in former versions. But with Webpack 5 and with Module Federation, it really works nicely. So what does it take to use this strategy? What does it take to use Module Federation? Let us have a look into the source code. Everything it takes us is a routing configuration. The routing configuration, that's the wrong one, I'm sorry. That's the wrong one. Vikings, here we go. Everything it takes us is a routing configuration, which is doing something like lazy loading. So from the source code's perspective, this is just lazy loading. But the thing here is, with Module Federation, you can map this path here to an external application. You can map this path to another application hosted on another origin on localhost 3000. And on demand, this very application is loaded and a specific part of it is used. So as you see here, using Module Federation is really drop-dead simple. By the way, if you want to know more about Module Federation, I did a full talk about it at ngVikings. Please check it out. It's meanwhile on YouTube. And also in my blog, I have a lot of articles and material around this topic. Saying this, Webpack 5 is a bit sound of the future. I think we can use it together with the CLI perhaps in fall this year. Then Webpack 5 should be ready, and also the CLI could incorporate this version of Webpack. So the future is bright, isn't it? Let's switch to the second topic. This is not a technical topic. It is more of a methodological topic. The big question is how to identify good subdomains and so good microfrontends. Because we all have the challenge to cut our big application into tiny parts that are implemented as separately deployable microfrontends. And to answer this question, you have to look at your business processes. Yes, I know we are not used that much to look at business processes, especially if we are architects. We are looking at frameworks, we are looking at libraries, we are looking at style guides. But here now we have to look at business processes. Because only if you know your business processes, you know where you can cut the whole process into self-contained pieces. What you see here is a very simple business process. It's about buying things for a company. First of all, the employee is requesting a product, and then the IT expert is specifying his or her request. The IT expert is saying, hey, you need a new laptop. You are an Angular developer. That's why you need a big, beautiful, and powerful laptop. And then the manager is saying, no, you don't get it because your laptop is only 12 years old. So please reuse it. Or yes, you get it because you are a nice person. And then, of course, the buying agent makes sure that everything is sent out to the right vendor. Just by looking at those processes, just by looking at those different roles, you can tell that each process step could be a micro front end of its own. Here we might have a catalog. Here you could have a specification system. Here you could have a management or an approval system. And here you could have a buying system or a purchase system. Normally, each domain has a domain expert of its own. And you see the 4 domain experts we are dealing here with. This really shows us that we might have several domains. Another indicator might be the main entities you are dealing with. For instance, when it comes to requesting a product, you are mainly dealing with products. When it comes to approving a product, the budget and the hierarchy of the company is more important. Of course, we are dealing a bit with products also here, but here the product might be as tiny as a little entity with a name and a price. That's everything the manager needs to decide, a name and a price. Here the product might be a name, a price, a picture, another picture, Q&As, different prices, different buying options, and so on and so forth. So we clearly see we have the product several times, but it plays a bigger role here. And it also has another structure here, because here we have the Q&As, here we have the pictures, here we have all the prices available. That's another indicator that you might have different domains which can be loosely coupled to each other. So to put it in another way, what I did first was to look at organizational boundaries like departments or like different domain experts. There is a reason why we have an IT department and management department and a purchasing department. And what I did then was looking at different models or looking at same entities with a different meaning. We have a different perspective to the product here and there. Those are 2 good indicators for identifying parts that can be developed and deployed in isolation. Of course, when talking about this topic, one big question is, what is the right domain size? And it's really a pity that we have chosen for the term microservice and micro frontend, because micro assumes that it is very, very tiny. But to be honest, it does not need to be that tiny. First of all, it should mirror a real-world domain, something that you can find out there in real world. A good friend of mine, by the way, gave me a hint. He told me, Manfred, the real world is where the pizza boy comes from. This was very important for me because I did not know what the real world is. So this is one prerequisite. And then on the other side, your domain has to be large enough that most use cases don't overlap its borders. Most use cases should happen within one domain, because it's not that funny for the user to switch domains, to switch micro frontends all the time. Just think about switching between Microsoft Word and Excel and PowerPoint and Access and OneNote all the time to just accomplish one task. That would be too much. On the other side, it has to be small enough that one team can concentrate on one domain and so on one microservice. If you want to reach the sweet spot of micro frontends, you have to find a way to assign a whole team to one micro frontend. They shall work in isolation. They shall focus on their part without the need to coordinate much with other teams. Saying this, if you only have one team, you might not need micro frontends. If you only have one team, micro frontends might be an overkill. No, they will very likely be an overkill. Of course, there is an exception for every rule. We have to look it on a per case basis, but in general, I would say you need to have several teams to reach the sweet spot. Saying this, I really encourage you to have a look into this book. domain-driven design. It's from the year 2002, so it's almost 20 years old, and nevertheless, it's a bestseller, which is quite seldom in the area of software engineering, that a 20 years old book is still a bestseller, but it still is, and it has a reason. It comes with a lot of smart ideas to deal with different domains and to make data flow between those domains. Another question, which is highly discussed most of the time with a lot of emotions, is the question monorepo versus polyrepo, which means, shall I put everything into one repository, or shall I go with several repos? And there are several advantages and disadvantages for both of those options. First of all, let's think about just using a mono repository. We can use a mono repository and model several domains there. We have one domain for a catalog application, the first microfrontend. We have another domain for the approval application, the second microfrontend. And we have this shared part with shared widgets and shared logic, things we need within each and every domain. In this case, we can fully go with just one mono repo, and each and every team just concentrates on their own part of the mono repository. As everything, this has some consequences. One consequence is it is easy to share code because the shared part is part of the mono repo. Just grab over to the shared part and reuse the component which is located over there. We can decouple between domains if we are using linting tools. We need some linting tools that makes it difficult to directly access other domains. Because if one domain is accessing another domain, they will depend on each other. And when they depend on each other, we need to talk to the other team. We also need to coordinate with the other team. We cannot develop in isolation anymore. We cannot deploy in isolation anymore, which means all the benefits of microfrontends would get rid. We would get rid of all of them. They would get lost. So decoupling is vital here. And so by means of linting, we can make sure that one part of the application is not allowed to access parts from another domain. We can very easily enforce a one version policy. Perhaps you don't want to have 5 versions of your shared libraries. Perhaps you don't want to have Angular 5 here and Angular 9 there. If we load them together into the browser, all hell might break loose. Also, mixing different technologies is possible with the mono repo, but in this case, please take care that you don't end up with a Frankenstein monster. You know, the Frankenstein monster, which was assembled of different parts of different dead bodies. You don't want to have something like this. But if you need to do it, in theory, also in practice, you can mix Angular with other technologies. Not because you want to, but because you have to in the long run. When it comes to a business software that needs to be maintained for 20 years, it might be beneficial to switch to another technology in, let's say, 7 years. The other option is to use different repositories. Because here we use different repositories, we have a full isolation by design. We cannot even try to access stuff from another domain because the other domain is in a repository of its own. We have isolation by design, and that's why microfrontends by the book use this approach. But this approach has some drawbacks. One big drawback is publishing your shared libraries can really be a pain. Because what does that mean? That means we have to write our libraries And every time we fix a bug, we have to assign a new version number, we have to publish the library, and we have to make sure that the library is installed here and installed there. npm install, npm update. If there is another bug, it begins at the start. We have to fix the bug here, we have to increase the version number, we have to publish everything, and then we have to install it into all the other domains. This might really drive you crazy. What are the other consequences? Well, as mentioned, enforcing a decoupled situation is very simple here because everything is decoupled because of all the different repositories. It even allows to use different versions of the same framework. Angular 5 here, Angular 7 there. But please decide by yourself if this is good or bad. It might be good because it gives you a lot of flexibility. It might be bad because when loading Angular in 2 different versions into the browser, you might end up with some issues. Of course, it depends upon how you do it, but one thing is sure, you will have very big bundle sizes if you load Angular several times in the same or in different versions. We can also mix and match different technology. One more time, this is beneficial in the long run, not in the short run. And here we need a lot of automation because if we need to deploy our libraries by hand and make sure that all the microfrontends are installing the newest versions of the libraries by hand, this will drive us nuts. Also, sharing code via npm and versioning might be a pain. It will very likely be a pain, so perhaps you will decide for monorepos for this reason. The thing is, when dealing with my customers, I have found out there are three types of customers. The first type is saying, hey, for sure, I'm going with a monorepo. The second type is saying, well, for sure, I'm going by the book. I'm using several repositories. And the third type of customer is saying, I don't know, and I'm not sure. What shall I do? And if they are not sure, I'm recommending to start with a mono repository. I'm recommending to start with something that is as easy as possible, as simple as possible. And I would say enforce decoupling via linting. Define some linting rules preventing you from accessing one domain from within the other domain. Because if the domains are decoupled, you can switch to a Bali repo a bit later. That means if in, let's say, 4 months, you feel the need to have several repositories, you can very easily refactor everything because your domains are not intermingled with each other. If you ask me, this is a sign for a good software architecture. A good software architecture is an architecture that allows you to do your decisions as late as possible. If you do your decisions as late as possible, you have as much information as possible. And that means you will hopefully do better decisions. An architecture which is respecting everything upfront is not a good architecture. It's an over-engineered architecture because it contains a lot of stuff you might or might not need later. And over-engineering is as bad as under-engineering because both makes it more complex as needed. Saying this, when going with a mono repository, I really recommend you to use NX. NX is an extension for the Angular CLI. It brings a lot of tooling for mono repos. It, for instance, gives you linting rules, which are preventing that one domain is easily directly accessing another domain. So check it out. Okay, so let's switch to another topic. Another big question I'm getting on a regular basis is how to deal with communication. And this is really a funny topic because communication in a micro front-end system is a trade-off. Why is that? Well, we have two goals. The first goal is having decoupled subdomains, micro front-ends, which do not need to know much about each other. The less they know about each other, the better it is. And on the other side, we want to have communication between the subdomains. But when we communicate much between those subdomains, we have coupling. They are intermingled to each other. So somehow this is a contradiction in itself. And in this case, you have to find the sweet spot. Of course, very often you cannot reach one of the extremes. You cannot reach the left extreme. You cannot reach the right extreme. You have to find the sweet spot, which is somewhere in the middle here. Perhaps a bit on that side, perhaps a bit more on this side. I have several ideas for this. First of all, use communication as little as possible. Perhaps you only need to share some context data like who is the current customer, who is the current patient, who is the current user. And if you need to communicate, use messaging or eventing because this guarantees loosely coupling. Messaging and eventing means I'm just triggering an event and domain event, which is, by the way, also an idea from domain-driven design. And domain event, which is telling all the other domains, hey, someone has requested a product. And then the other domains can decide upon whether they want to react upon this event or not. Perhaps they are saying, hey, I'm not interested, or they are saying, hey, cool, I'm interested because this triggers another business process in my domain. Eventing really allows loosely coupling because another domain can react upon it, but it does not need to react upon events. Trigger a domain event and don't expect an answer. Perhaps everyone is interested, perhaps no one is interested at all. For this, you need to go with a simple, let's call it message bus. It can be really a simple thing, like an Angular service, if everything is Angular, with an replace subject. Of course, you should isolate this replace subject, make it private, and provide some public functions for it to prevent misuse. But this is the general idea. Also, consider server-side messaging. Very often, we need to have messaging on the server side using message queues and topics. Perhaps this microservice here needs to send some data over to the other message, or to the other microservice. Here we might have a product data, and we need the same products for the approval, but in a different representation. Here we have the full product. Here we just have the product name and the price, which is important for the manager. So one thing that comes in mind when talking about communication is, shall we use Redux, NGRX, or something like this for communication? And I would say, well, I would not share state between subdomains. So if one subdomain knows the state of the other subdomain, we have something we don't want to have, namely coupling. And honestly, loosely coupling is why we are doing all of this. So sharing state might be everything but beneficial. But if you decide to use or misuse Redux for eventing, for sending actions back and forth, this might be okay. Personally, I would rather go with a message bus. I would use Redux in one domain, in another domain, but for the communication, I would just go with a simple message bus because this is as simple as possible. Another topic and question that really fits to the topic of communication is sharing widgets. And honestly, here we have the same situation. Sharing widgets is a trade-off too. Because one more time, the goal is to decouple subsystems, to make them developable and runable in isolation. And on the other side, we want to share widgets. Sharing widgets, of course, prevents duplicate code. Don't repeat yourself is a rule we have learned in the last decades. But on the other side, if we want to decouple everything, we need to go separate ways, which is just a fancy domain-driven design term for duplicate code. It's never duplicated within one domain, but we might have two domains with similar code. And so one more times, you have to decide between those two options. You can go fully decoupled, but going fully decoupled means you have to implement everything by yourself. You can share everything. That means you are fully dry, but in this case, you will not have decoupled subsystems. So one more time, the sweet spot for you might be somewhere in the middle here. And it depends upon you and your architectural goals, if it is here or here or here. For this, you need to evaluate your architectural goals, your situation against those options. My recommendation is sharing technical widgets like the implementation of a design system is fully okay, because technical widgets do not change their API that often. I mean, the API of a drop-down field is quite stable, if you ask me. And it does not lead to coupling between domains, because this is not about domain logic. But I would not share use case specific widgets. At least try to avoid it. I have seen very good reasons to share domain specific widgets, use case specific widgets, but before you do it, think about if it is possible to avoid sharing, because sharing creates coupling. So you can't have both the ice cream and the money you have to spend for the ice cream, or in this case, you can have decoupling and dry at the same time. And so know your architectural goals to be capable of evaluating where your sweet spot is on that line. That sounds a bit sorry, but on the other side, I have a good message for you. Very often, separate ways does not really mean duplicate code. Why is this? Well, for this, we have to look into domain-driven design one more time. Domain-driven design has this idea of the bounded context. The bounded context defines a boundary, and only within this boundary, your data model makes sense, or let's say your domain model. Only within this boundary. Outside of this boundary, this model does not make sense. So here we see a very simple example. We have a product here, and this product is the product from the catalog's perspective. It only makes sense for the catalog because it have different prices, different pictures, Q&As, and so on and so forth. This product does not make sense for approval because the manager is interested into other data, title, price, and the budget he or she needs to use to pay the product, to pay for the product. So we have different representations within different bounded contexts. And that's the reason why separate ways does not necessarily mean we have duplicated source code, because we have another style of data on the left and on the right, which calls for other components, of course. By the way, domain-driven design also says within a bounded context, we have this, I call it general language, because this term is very difficult to pronounce for my tongue. the general language, which is the language the business users are using. So don't invent your own terms. Don't call it item when they call it a product. It is important to speak their language to be able to get rid of misunderstandings and to be able to effectively communicate with them. One more time, domain-driven design brings a lot of ideas for all those topics. So when talking about shared components, most of the time this topic comes up, web components. Because web components really easily allow you to share code, even between micro frontends, which are using different technologies like AngularJS, Angular, Vanilla.js. Are there other JavaScript frameworks? I don't think so. So what's about web components? Well, they can be useful, especially if you have to mix several technologies. And they are useful because they have Shadow DOM, which helps you to isolate your CSS styles. You don't want that one component is affecting the styling of a different component. That is not something you want to have. This will cause you a lot of headache. And Shadow DOM helps here by isolating the styles. Also, and that's also a good message, lazy loading separately developed web components is really a piece of cake. Just create a script tag, just reference the bundle with the web component, and you can use the web component as each and every traditional HTML element. You can use it like a table, like an image, like a div. So one thing that really helps me to understand how to use web components is this model here. In this model, I have two levels of architecture. The first architecture is what I'm calling the macro architecture. The macro architecture holds together the different micro apps, the different micro frontends. This is about loading one micro frontend, another micro frontend, a third micro frontend into your shell application. This is the macro level. The micro level is more about sharing tiny widgets, like sharing your drop-down field, like sharing like your design system you have implemented to provide a common look and feel to transport your brand to possible customers. And you can use web components on both levels, but you don't have to. On both levels, we have alternatives. On this level, we can use framework-specific components. If everything here is Angular, there is no need to have web components. If everything here is Angular, just go with Angular components. It's the easiest way to share stuff if there is only one framework. Of course, if you have different technologies, Angular and AngularJS, Vanilla.js, then web components will be very in handy. On the macro level, we have a plenty of options. Here, web components is only one option. Another option might be to load full single page applications into your index HTML, or to go with hyperlinks, or as you have seen before, Webpack 5 module federation, which, if you ask me, will really be a game changer. So what I want to say with this, please know your options and decide for those options or against them with a view to your architectural needs. So another question a lot of people are coming up with is authentication and authorization. And this is a huge topic, of course, because, security is everything but easy. This is one thing, I'm sure. But to put it in a nutshell, there are two big possibilities. One possibility is to use HTTP-only cookies. but in this case, you have to bundle all your micro frontends through one origin, and you need to go with cross-site request forgery tokens. And the other possibility is to share tokens via the header, send tokens via the header to the backend. And in this case, you can have different origins because you decide when you send which token via which HTTP header. In this case, I would encourage you to go with OAuth2 or with OpenID Connect, which are two really heavy use standards out there in the wild. In this case, of course, you have to find a way to share the tokens. When using cookies, this works automatically because this is what the browser is doing, sending back the cookie to the origin it came from. Here you need to share the token by hand by using the message bus or by using session storage, something like this. Okay, let's come to a last question. This is also a question I'm discussing with a lot of people out there. It's about, shall we have one microservice per micro frontend, or vice versa? Shall we have one micro frontend per microservice? And the answer is, if it is possible, then yes, do this. Because this gives you verticals, isolated verticals, and one more time, you can assign a whole team on one vertical, a whole cross-functional team. Of course, they will have some front-end experts and they will have some back-end experts. So if you can reach this situation, it would be ideal. One team per vertical. But on the other side, I have also seen situations where this was not possible for a plenty amount of reasons. Perhaps the back-end team is separated from the front-end team, or perhaps the microservices are already there, or perhaps you have a lot of general purpose microservices and you need to orchestrate them to different front-ends. There are several reasons. Some of them are good, some of them are not that good. Why do not go with a one-to-one mapping? And in this case, I'm recommending a backend for frontend. The backend for frontend is a backend, but it is owned by the frontend team. Very often it is developed in a language which the front-end team likes, like Nest.js or something like this. And this backend to front-end is only doing one thing. It is orchestrating the real microservices to give some use cases to the micro front-end. And this brings a lot of advantages. First of all, the micro front-end does not need to know all the services. It only needs to know its very own backend for front-end. It does not need to trigger calls here and there, which might be an overkill. You know, the more HTTP calls you have, the worse it is for your performance. So in this case, you could just go with one call, and this one call is then multiplexed to several calls. You will gain a lot of performance, and also you gain some amount of isolation because you can develop the micro front end in isolation. If something changes here, you only need to adjust everything there. You can even mock your backend for front end for testing purposes. So as you see here, a lot of advantages. Nevertheless, please remind this approach. So if possible, please go with this very approach. Please go with full verticals. So when talking about all those topics like sharing code and micro frontends versus micro backends or microservices, there is one topic that comes up all the time. And this topic is about dashboards. The big question is how to implement dashboards. And this is a good question because somehow the dashboard is a very special part of a micro front-end architecture. It is very special because there are a lot of special forces. One more time, on the one side, you want to have a decoupled subsystem or several decoupled subdomains. On the other side, you want to have a dashboard. And what's a dashboard? A dashboard is a piece of software dealing with data from all the subdomains, which is causing coupling, isn't it? So if you have data and widgets, perhaps from each subdomains, you couple the dashboard highly to those domains. And one more time, you have to find the sweet spot between those two extremes. For me, there are two approaches to deal with dashboards. One approach is to load widgets from each subdomains, and those widgets will also load data from their very own subdomain. This provides a lot of flexibility, but it also demands for stable contracts, because if the contracts are changing on a regular basis, the domains will destroy the dashboard. If the widget works in a different way from now to then, the dashboard might not know it, and perhaps the dashboard might not work as expected. You also need to agree on a common look and feel, and at the end of the day, you will have a lot of HTTP calls, because each and every dashboard tile is loading its very own data from its very own backend. On the other side, you can declare your dashboard as a subdomain of its own. And this is what I'm doing with a bigger customer in the area of taxes and in the area of lawyers. There, our dashboard is just a subdomain of its own and hence a micro front end of its own. And here, of course, the pros and cons are fully inversed. So what does that look like? Well, one more time, here we have a dashboard. It is talking to its own backend for frontend. This backend for frontend is caching data, and sometimes it is synchronizing with all the other microservices. So the dashboard provides one and only the one API to the dashboard frontend. The dashboard frontend does not need to know all the other microservices. And if here the contract is broken, we can still use the cache data here. So it is not that big a deal, not a big deal. Okay, as you see here, this is not a simple topic. There are a lot of things to respect, but in general, this is what software architecture is about. Software architecture is mainly about thinking about trade-offs. So you need to be a pretty emotionless bastard if you want to be an architect. Just look at your goals and think about what hurts you more and what hurts you not that much from the available options. So if you like this talk, you might like my ebook. You find it on my blog here. Okay, so before we finish, I have one funny thing for you, because this was a lot of theory, a lot of trade-offs. No one likes really trade-offs. That's why we have a funny thing for you. Namely, do you know the game Snake? For sure you know it. Well, there is a nice Angular-based implementation. It's called ngX Snake. It is under MIT license, and it has been developed by this nice person here. And what I did on ngVikings about a month ago was I took this implementation and I implemented it as a new implementation using module federation. By using module federation, we can load a strategy at runtime which is controlling the snake. That means you can create your own strategy for controlling a snake You can deploy it somewhere in the internet. You can load it into this game, and then your very own strategy from this server will control the snake on that server. And for this, we did a challenge. And several people wrote their own strategy, and they sent us their strategy. And here in this part of this meetup, I will look to two of those strategies. Those two people have really written nice strategies. The first one is from Jesper, the second one is from Andreas. So Jesper implemented the A* algorithm to send the snake around. Let me copy Jesper's URL. This URL is pointing to, I think, his implementation. And then let's open ngXnake. When restarting everything, it is asking me which strategy I want to go with. And here I'm going with my very own strategy. It is a drop dab simple strategy. It is sending around the snake in a random manner. So let's have a look at it. Start game, no balls, and yeah, you see, it's a random snake, perhaps a drunken snake. It is not capable of finding the fruit. Well, sometimes it finds the fruit, but you know, even a damage clock tells you the right time 2 days a day. So yeah, it is really randomly. Perhaps it managed it. No, it will starve, I guarantee you. So now let's go with the more meaningful strategy from Jesper. And I guarantee you, it's a lot of fun to look at such a snake which is driving around in an automatic way, especially after some seconds when everything is quite quick. So let's load it. Start the game without walls. Okay, this was an error. Let's restart it. Yeah, here we go. You see, she is very smart, this snake, she or he, I don't know. And yeah, it's really fun, isn't it? It's the future of computer gaming. We don't need to game by ourselves. The computer will do it for us. And it will become quite funny in some seconds when the snake is speeding up. You see it now. It is accelerating. Boy. What a smart animal, isn't it? Yeah, it is accelerating further. Oh, yeah, this is very stressful for me. I cannot look anymore. Look at this. 84 points. Well, that's nice. So let's write it down here. 84 points. Now let's have a look at the implementation of Andreas. Reload everything and now go with this solution. Yeah, somehow I have a bug here. Let's restart it. Andreas solution. Yeah, it works. And you see, it is a different strategy, isn't it? So it is turning around a bit more often. And I guarantee you, it will be funny when it accelerates. But I think it's also quite fast. Wow, yeah, what a stress. Puff. Yeah, 70 points. Best score is 84 points. So let's write it down. So saying this, I think both strategies are really doing a good job. And if we are restarting the application, perhaps the points will differ a bit. Perhaps Andreas will have some more points and Jesper will have less points. So it really depends on the fruits that are randomly displayed. But I think that's a nice example for module federation. It's a funny example, and so I would say let's declare both of them as the winners. And I think Sherry prepared something for them. They will get some swag from the NG Vikings team, which is kind of nice. Cool. So congrats. And yeah, if you like this idea, just check it out. You will find this idea in all the materials I will provide you after this talk. I also will provide you the different implementations and the description that tells you how to implement your very own snake strategy. Okay, cool.
That was pretty great.
Pardon?
I said that was pretty great, and the implementation and everything was pretty nice. And yes, so definitely NG Vikings is going to send a swag box to both of them, to both Andreas and Jasper as well. And also, since the implementation that they made, it is totally open source. Microsoft is also going to give them each of them a kudos badge, which is like a thank you for contributing to the open source. So they will also get that one as well.
Very nice. That's cool. Thank you, Sherry.
Yes.
Okay, so after this already was the demonstration of Snake. We can come to the conclusion. What did we see today? I think we have seen that microfrontends, and this is very important for me, is first and foremost about scaling teams. And teams is plural. A good friend of mine told me that means we need to have more than one, because otherwise it would not be plural. You will only reach the sweet spot, or very likely only reach the sweet spot, if you have more than one team. It's about decoupling between subdomains, decoupling between micro frontends, which can be developed and also shipped in isolation. Module federation, which will come to Webpack 5 in some months, allows us to import stuff from other applications. So please check it out. One more time, you find some material in my blog and also in the recordings of NG Vikings. I've given a talk about this. Another aspect is know your domain. You really need to know it. Communication and sharing widgets, it's always about trade-offs. You cannot have both. Communication and sharing widgets on the one side and loosely coupling on the other side. So for this, please find your sweet spot and decide between monorepo versus polyrepo. If you are not sure, start small with a monorepo, use NX, and so you can switch to a polyrepo a bit later if you really feel the need for it. Chances are high that you will not feel the need for it. At least this is my experience. Okay, so one more time, thank you for having me. Here you have all my contact data. I will upload my material in the next hour to my blog. And if you want, follow me on Twitter so that we can keep in contact. So thanks for this. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the meetup.
Yeah, thank you very much, Manfred. It was a great talk as usual, and I personally learned a lot. So now let's see that if there are questions from the attendees, and as a reminder, you can type your questions there. So I will just pass that on to Manfred. We have one here. And that can you talk about microfrontends with several frameworks?
Yeah, so I have also customers doing this, and I have also some showcases for it. when you have to mix and match several frameworks, you can, for instance, load the different SPAs into one index HTML, which means you are referencing the main bundle from this SPA and from that SPA, and perhaps you will have different frameworks within those SPAs. That's one thing. If you want to go with web components, that would be also an option, because web components are developed for this very case to mix and match different technologies. And you can also mix and match web components with module federation. This would be a third option. So if you check out my blog, you will find at least one article with some source code on GitHub which deals with this. You need to respect several things. As always, at first sight, it looks to be a simple thing, but it becomes a bit tough when it comes to the details. That's why I'm referencing to my blog here.
Yes, thank you. And the other one is great talk, Manfred. So
thank you, Pia.
And I wonder if anyone else has questions from audience. So while we have Manfred here. I guess we don't have anything for now yet. So yeah, thank you, Manfred. I also posted your video to the NG Vikings also here for the attendees. So that talk was also pretty informative. Yes, thank you very much again for joining us. It was a great pleasure as usual. And yes, so if you want to follow Manfred, I guess he shared his Twitter handle, but I also have it here as well. So yes. So yeah, thank you very much. So
yeah, I thank you for having me. Thanks. And see you around, perhaps virtual or in person the next time. Let's see.
Yes, hopefully we can get back to good old days soon.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. And then our next speaker for today is Ashnita. And hi, Ashnita. Thanks for joining us. So Ashnita is organizer of GDG Reading, and she's also a fellow Women Tech Maker ambassador. And last time I met Ashnita, it was actually the last year's NG Vikings in Copenhagen. It's been some time, Ashnita.
It was a brilliant experience. It was my first time attending and speaking at NG Viking. It was really special. And I was glad to be that you had NG Viking this year again. So that's good.
Yeah, and it was and you did a great live coding on the stage, which I still remember. It was one of the best that I've ever seen. So
great.
Yeah, thank you. So Ashnita today is going to talk about. Let me actually share your screen as well. So she's going to give a talk about binding to CSS custom properties in Angular. And so, stage is yours, Ashnita, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherry, for a lovely introduction. And thank you for inviting me to take part in NG Copenhagen today. I'm really glad to be taking part in your meetup, and hearing Manfred's talk was great. Today I'm going to talk about binding to CSS custom properties in Angular. It is one of the new features that came about in Angular 9. the ability to bind CSS custom properties. So I have been pretty excited to share this with you. The agenda is quite simple, really. As you probably know, creating style bindings in Angular is really quite simple. Angular makes it very easy for us. So most of what we're going to talk about today is to cover the basics of CSS custom properties. So we will talk about what CSS custom properties are, how to create them, what scope the CSS custom properties have, how to retrieve the value from a CSS custom property. And then we will switch over to a couple of demos to see examples of using CSS custom properties in a style sheet with more static values, and then using Angular to create dynamic stylings by binding with to CSS custom properties with style binding. So let's get started. So what are CSS custom properties? Well, the name kind of gives it away. CSS custom properties are CSS properties, first of all, but they are custom made. So they are created by us. So one good way to learn about CSS custom properties is to compare it with CSS properties. CSS properties are built in, provided by the browser. They're used to create styles for the elements. On the other hand, CSS custom properties are created by us, the for use in our front-end application, and it's used to store values. These values can then be retrieved and used in styling by using it in property declarations. And then from then on, both are pretty much the same. So both CSS properties and custom properties are subject to inheritance. So some of the CSS properties, the child inherits the value set on the parent. The CSS custom properties set on a parent are inherited by the children. Both cascade, both can be queried and changed dynamically with JavaScript. So CSS custom properties are a relatively new feature in CSS. So you may wonder about the browser compatibility. So the good news is that most modern browsers support CSS custom properties, so which is great. So now let us talk a bit about how to create the CSS custom properties. Just like CSS properties, declarations, we create CSS custom properties in a style rule. So a style rule has two parts. It has got the selector, which identifies what elements the styles will apply to. And then the second part is the declaration block, which is all the CSS property declarations within the curly braces. So within the declaration block, we specify the CSS property declarations, which is used to style the actual elements. And this is where we specify the CSS custom property declarations as well. So another way is also to create inline styles. You're probably familiar with the style attribute syntax. So we go style equals, and then here the dash with, I forgot to mention earlier, actually the dash denotes a custom CSS custom property. So we give a custom name and a value. The name has to begin with the 2 dashes, and then it is best practice to give a name which is going to be descriptive of the value that's assigned to this property. And then in terms of the value, it can be any valid CSS value. So it can have a color value or a measurement value, etc. But the thing to keep in mind is that this value will have to be compatible with the CSS property that will eventually be used to create styles. So here, when we assign 50%, it is compatible to be used as a width, for example. Okay, so once we create the CSS custom properties, they have a scope. So what is that scope? Let's see. The most specific scope we can have is when we create an inline CSS property. So here we've got a div with a CSS custom property called primary color. So this primary color is only available to this div. So any other style rules will not be able to access the value of that we've set here. So that's inline scope. And then when we use a selector like a class, for example, the selector will identify all the elements that this class have this class, and then all of those elements will have this CSS custom property created with this value. And also through inheritance, the descendants of those elements will also get this CSS custom property. So to create a global scope, we can use the pseudo class root, which is pretty much the same as the HTML selector, but with a higher specificity. So this would make these custom properties, CSS custom properties, available to every element in this document. So now that we've seen how to create CSS custom properties in a declaration block, we next have to think about how do we retrieve the values from the CSS custom property so we can assign it to a style. So there is a CSS function called the var function, which works hand in hand with the CSS custom properties. Basically, the var function takes 2 parameters. The first would be the CSS custom property name, and then the second parameter is the fallback value. So if the CSS property does not exist, for example, or it has an invalid value, not compatible, let's say, to the CSS property that we want to assign it to, then the fallback value will be used. And in the case that the fallback value isn't available either, then it will, if the CSS property is one that is inherited by the child, then the inherited value will be used. Otherwise, the initial value set by the user agent will be assigned to the CSS property. And as you can see, the var function has been used in a property CSS property declaration here. So, but it's not only the CSS property declaration. It is the CSS custom property declaration where we can use a var function to retrieve a previously declared CSS custom property value. In fact, anywhere where CSS values are expected in a property declaration, we can use the var function to retrieve the value, the CSS custom property value. So it could be a single value that we're assigning to a CSS property, or it could be part of a shorthand statement. So for example, if we have border, for example, we can go 1 pix solid and then get the value, use var function to get the value of a CSS custom property. We will see examples in a bit. So I will just introduce the ideas at this moment. And then the third thing I wanted to mention, which is quite exciting, is that we can use the var function within CSS functions, other CSS functions, that is. So it includes CSS functions like the HSL or HSLA function to create a HSLA color value. And also quite powerful is the ability to use the calc function. The ability to use CSS custom property values within a calc function. So that has been quite sort of more theoretical, and I think the only way to really see this is if we go and have a look at the demos at the moment. So let's switch over to that. Okay, so I have created a quick, so I'm going to use a Stack Blitz project for the demo today. And first of all, I want to just show examples of how to create CSS custom properties in a style sheet, how to retrieve the value and use it in other functions. So I'm in the styles.css. So here I'm going to create a global style, and I'm going to have the selector as HTML, and I want to create a CSS custom property called primary hue and assign it a value, let's say 180. So as you see, the 2 dashes or hyphens followed by the name of the actual custom property, CSS custom property. And I'm trying to use a name that will reflect and be descriptive of the value that it holds, so that this makes our style sheet more easier to read and gives semantic meaning to the values. So they're not just going to be some arbitrary value like 180. It will stand for primary hue. Okay, so now I'll create another CSS property called primary color, and then here I want to use a HSL function, which is a CSS function, and then I will use the var function to retrieve the primary hue as the first parameter to the HSL function, and then the second parameter is saturation, which I'm probably just going to use 100%. And then lightness, so I will use 60% for now. Okay, so using these values, we can create a sort of a global color theme here. So I will create another CSS custom property for hover, and then when we hover, I will reduce the lightness by 40%, and then let's create another CSS custom property for active color value, and this I will reduce even by 30%. So as you see, what I am trying to do here is use one primary hue and base color scheme from that. And then I would base a accent color color on the primary hue. So what I want to do is perhaps sort of have it quite similar to the hue. So I would add like 30 degrees so I can access the primary hue. But what I can do, which is quite powerful, is use this in a calculation. So within a calc function, I can pass the var function, which will substitute the primary hue with the value 180. So it is the calculated value that, so calc will get the calculated value. And then to that, I just want to add 30 degrees. So now I've got the accent color, and I could try and do something similar to here to for the accents as well. So okay, so at this moment we are just only creating the custom properties, and as you see, nothing happens with just the custom properties. There's no actual styles. I mean, okay, the other thing is I don't actually have so let me get rid of this. So okay, so nothing's actually happened with me having just created the CSS custom properties. In order to use it, I need to use it in a style rule. So, to create the style rules, we still use CSS properties as per normal. So I'm going to create a style rule here for primary color. So I've got a button here which has already been styled to have some paddings, etc. So I want to create a primary a button with a primary color, and when I hover on it, it would use the theme color, and when it's active, it should use the theme color. So so I'll set the background color to use the primary color. And if I go and use this class now, you should finally be able to see something on screen. Okay, so that's the color that I had chosen. And then if I just quickly go ahead and create the hover and the active as well. So hover, I want to use just the primary, I think I called it color hover. As you see, when I hover on the button, it uses the value which is 10% less, well, 10% darker than the main color. Okay, and if I can just do that quickly for active as well, and I can use the active color, and so hover and active, you can see that it's using the values that I've set up in the global styles. So the main point with this is that now we have defined these values in one place, and we can use, so it helps to keep the styles consistent. And then if we want to change the value because perhaps the branding color changes or anything like this, so we can just change to another value, and everything else is still based on the calculations, and they work out nicely and we have to only change in one place. Okay, so let me just, to finish this demo, try and use the accent color. So I have an accent button here, perhaps, and then background color. We use accent color, and then okay. Okay, something didn't work. Let me just see. Okay, so I've made a mistake here. So this should be accent hue. And then in the accent color, I need to use the hue. So let me just put that here. So this, I want to be accent color, and it chooses now the accent hue. So as you see, we have got the accent hue, which is a calculation from the primary hue. And whenever we change one value, everything else falls in place. So making our code really quite easy to maintain. So that is an example of using CSS custom properties for global theming. I just want to show another example which will demonstrate the use of cascading values. So let me just say, okay, perhaps I have got 3 circles. Class is circle, and then okay, and then if I style these, so I'm going to just circle styles here. So circle is quite simple, which is so I will create a CSS custom property to keep the size of the circle. So basically diameter, so DIAMETER, I think that's correct spelling, and give it 75 pixels. And then the width I can use, so I'll use the var function to get this property value, and then use but this is an example of using it not in a global scope, but more in a narrow scope within this class. And I've done it because the value is being repeated. And then, okay, so let me just finish creating the circle. So I've got width, height, so border radius is 50%, and then background color, I can use our primary color. Okay, so I've got these 3 circles already, and what I wanted to show is that we can override this diameter value, so to create. So basically now I'm able to I'm able to just override this, and then we can have the different sizes. So large can be 100 pixels. And then let's go and use them here. So first one can be small, then large. Okay. Something didn't quite work with the small one, so let me just see. Okay, So I'm not quite sure. I cannot spot what it is that I've done wrong, but I hope that you can see that we are able to, perhaps it's a spelling. Okay, there we are. So this basically demonstrates that we are able to cascade the values just in the same way as we can with CSS properties, which is really quite nice. Okay, so that's to show just the basics of using CSS properties, custom properties in our style sheet. Now for using it in Angular. So I thought it is much easier to, because style binding is pretty simple in Angular, and there isn't much to learn there really, but so it will be good to just see through an example of how to create a dynamic style using CSS custom properties. So in this demo, I have got basically a use case where, for example, if you imagine if you have a markdown viewer where you have an editor on one side and the previewer on the other side, and then you have got icons that can basically simply give you maximize the width of the container or minimize it. So at this moment, we haven't got it implemented. So that's what I would like to implement using CSS custom properties. So basically, let us see the markup. So we have two sections, and it's got a component which is basically the icon that is to minimize and maximize and toggle the width rather. So we could achieve this using style binding. So let's go ahead and use that first to just see. So we could use style binding and say style.width is okay. So I have got this property here, which is maximized, and the width returns the width it should be. So basically, I have the smaller width is 40% of the screen, and the wider is the 90%, so as to give a little bit of spacing. So in the style binding, I can just go and use the width. I mean, I could have done it here to say is maximized, and then so I could do this way, %, let's say, and say is maximized, and then use 90, or it should be 40. And so you see, with style binding, we're able to expand the width. And so to get both of them, we will have to create the style binding on the second section container as well, so that both of them have got the same behavior. So so as you see, we can use style binding for this, but I would like to show how to use CSS custom property binding. Just makes it that much sort of neater, so that we can have it in one place. So instead of declaring them on the separate sections, if I could create a wrapper around both, and then declare the property binding on that, and then through inheritance, the sections will get its value. So I could go main, perhaps, or a div, and then create the style binding here. So the style binding syntax is very similar to style binding to CSS custom properties syntax is very similar to binding to CSS properties. So basically, we use the name we want, and let's say width. So using the 2 dashes says that we are using the we are creating a custom property, and then I'll have to I'll have to change the style here a little bit. So instead of host, I've now got a wrapper. Okay, and so I get the very same behavior with the CSS custom property binding. But in this case, we've been able to just do it in one place, create the binding in one place, and both of them, both of these elements get the property. So just to see that the section is it's styling the width by using the var function, and it's used the CSS property. And in the case when we had just created the binding with style, the width, it was using the width 40%. So while it didn't have a value, it used 40% as the fallback value. Okay, so now you may be thinking that, what if we don't want to use a wrapper, and instead we want to create the binding on the host? So let me just switch it back to having this style again. So we can create CSS custom property binding on the host by using the host binding decorator. So and I already had this getter here to get the width. So it's really quite simple. So host binding, and then I'm binding to the style property, and then give the CSS custom property name, which is width. Okay, so now it should again have the same behavior. So we are able to dynamically change the width by clicking on the icon to toggle the sizes. So and this is really quite a simple example to demonstrate CSS custom properties, and it isn't really that CSS custom properties are to replace dynamic styling is not so that you kind of not stop using CSS binding to CSS properties. It's more that in the use case when you have when you want to reuse the value in multiple places, then it is suitable to use CSS custom properties instead of just binding to the CSS property. So hopefully that has given a taste of what some use case for it in and how to use it in Angular. So right, so actually I haven't really got anything more than that. So if maybe I'll just switch back to here. So let me just minimize these. So okay, so okay, so that is all I have really on doing the demonstration for CSS custom properties binding with Angular. And as you can see, there isn't too much. I mean, it's basically the same. So Angular takes care of binding through change detection, and it sets initial value, and each time we change it, you know, when the property when something in the expression changes the value, it will just get the new value. So it's yeah, so it's really quite similar, pretty much the same, except for the additional dash in front of the property name. That's all. So yeah, so this is all I have to share with you. Thank you. Sherry, we cannot hear you at this moment. I think you may be muted.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you. Yeah, I was saying that thank you very much for the great talk. This is actually pretty interesting topic. It's pretty simple, but at the same time, it brings give us a lot of flexibility. I personally I started to use it after I switched to using web components a lot, because these CSS variables actually also help you a lot, and it becomes very handy when you want to customize your web components from outside. You simply create this variable and just pass it along. So it's pretty nice. And yeah, that we have actually one question here for you, Ashnita. It kind of that needs a little bit of clarification. That what are the benefits of these CSS custom properties over SAS and the function?
Yeah. So the main thing is that I mean, it's not really there to just replace SAS functions. You can use both. But the main advantage of CSS custom properties is that it's native. So so one of the features is that the values cascade, the inherited. I mean, the properties cascade. The values are inherited by the children, and also that they're dynamic. So we can query the CSS custom property values with JavaScript or TypeScript, and also manipulate it at runtime. So we can use it to create dynamic styles. But as I said, we already have style binding. I mean, you can already create dynamic styles using by manipulating the CSS properties themselves. But is this advantage of having the value stored in one place that can be reused? So the advantage that we enjoy with SAS variables, having that together with the dynamic makes it really quite a good, like even a good option over binding to CSS properties, so that we can make the code more maintainable. So
yeah, that's very true. And there is a thank you for you as well. And I wonder that if there are more questions while Ashnita is here, you can ask your questions here as well. But in general, yeah, to me, the bigger advantage is also exactly that they are native.
yes.
And then you can say that use the platform.
Yeah. In cases where like you're not using SAS already, then it's so you don't have to introduce something. But of course, it's not in place of. You can use together. Even I've seen great articles where suggesting how you can use both. But yeah, there are advantages of it being native.
So, is there more questions, or the Danish viewers that can start an hands night?
So, what is the festival called today? The festival you have, summer solstice?
Yeah, it's a St. Hen's night. Which
Okay.
is exactly that. You can say that it's mark the beginning of the summer in reality, and
Nice.
there's some fires and drinking, friends gathering, and yeah.
That sounds lovely. Yeah.
And in the back, if we want to look at the history, maybe it is a little bit not kind of that not very nice because they used to burn witches, but nowadays it is it's actually it's pretty nice. Casualty, I promise. Singing and dancing and then having your friends over. So I would say yeah, thanks Ashnita, and thanks to all of you that you listen to us. I posted here that please fill out our feedback form because we want your feedback to improve, and also we want to know that what are the topics that you want to hear next time as well. So I would say let's just start the partying, the St. Hen's, and see you all very soon. We are still not sure that if we are going to have a July edition or not, because yeah, it's July. You want to go on kind of that a staycation instead of vacation. But we will post it. We had some fun ideas for having a summer edition. But yes, if you give us your feedback, that would be fantastic. So thank you all, and see you all next time. Bye bye.
Thank you for having me. Bye bye.